Mm. Well, hello to everybody. This is Nordic Horizons, and hello to folk who are watching us on Independence Live. I should say before we start, I realise it's probably not everybody's been to a Nordic Horizons meeting before. We are actually an apolitical group who was set up, Jings, 12 years ago to try and learn a little bit more about our nearest neighbours, who also have this habit of being tediously good at practically everything that we're kind of so-so at. So we have no stance on anything politically. And this would be a good example tonight because what we're discussing, local democracy, is just the Cinderella of Scottish politics, of British politics. Really, nobody cares. And yet, it's a strange one because we are actually quite exceptional. We, in Scotland, have the largest local, so-called local councils in the developed world. Nearly everybody seems to agree that's not okay. And the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, COSLA, produced a report probably about 8 years ago now, which accepted that we have far too big councils and that has hollowed out democracy in Scotland over the last 50 years. And even COSLA, now bear in mind it represents the existing large councils, it called for about 100 councils. And just so you get your eye in for this before we start, Scotland has just 32 councils. That's 32 unitary councils. Now, it's worth remembering that because we have two great contributors tonight. One is Dennis Holm from the Faroes. Now, the Faroes, I think, has 30 or perhaps 29 councils. We'll clarify that in a minute. And they have a whopping 55,000 people in the Faroes, right? I could have hit you with a load of slides here, but let's not do that yet. 30 councils for 55,000 people. Scotland, 32 councils for 5.4 million people. I mean, that gives you an idea of where we are on this, and it's kind of not that great. We also have a comparison with Norway, and we'll be hearing from its state secretary for local government. Now, this is astonishing because I can tell you that despite being a broadcaster for a very long time, I don't think I've ever interviewed a local government minister from Scotland or the UK government, certainly not being able to record him and play it in his absence as we're about to do. But he was really keen to learn more about Scotland and let us know how Norway works. 356 local councils for the same population as Scotland, which has 32. So I hope you're getting the drift here. We're weird. We're well out of line. And so we're trying to find out. I think most people are kind of aware of this, but they don't know and they haven't confidence in how it could work to have smaller councils. It sounds like a recipe for duplication, for massive costs, for having 2,000 million different kind of service directors who are all paid big salaries, and perhaps unfair to council areas whose populations are poorer on average than some of the richer ones. How does that work? So we're trying to lay some of these ghosts tonight. We're trying to find out how it works and how, perhaps for remote and rural areas, having really micro councils, as they would be seen in our book, how that might be the only way that you manage to survive the changing trends that there are across the whole Northern Atlantic for small and remote areas. So that's just by way of introduction. We're going to start off as well by just introducing our own Mike Danson. I don't know if he's actually in vision or not at the moment, Professor Mike Danson, because not only is he part of the Nordic Horizons steering group, but relevantly, he's a member of the Jimmy Reid Foundation board. And that board, or rather the Jimmy Reid Foundation, produced an excellent report on all of this, the Silent Crisis Report. I've put the link already into chat there if you actually want to have a look at that later. I've got to say, I sent it to our Norwegian State Secretary, and his jaw was on the ground at the end of it. So it's quite a read. Now, let's start off just with a little poll, just to show how clever Dan can be with the old Zoom thing when he's got a few minutes. We're going to ask, first of all, Dan, can you put up that that poll? Right. So do you think that Scotland's councils are actually local? And that's really implying, are they genuinely local councils, or are they too big to be considered local? So can you vote now? Yes, they are local, or no, they don't cut that. Dan, are you seeing people answering?
I am indeed. We have got 38 people voted so far, in fact. Of the 50 people who are in the meeting, we have 38 people have voted.
Right. Okay. So everybody else, don't sit on the fence. I know we could have put don't know, but you can't. So can you just decide? And we'll stop. And let's take Kevin's great device. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. What's the result, Dan?
There we go. Can you see that?
Yep. Okay, so perhaps after my diatribe, it was a bit expected, but sure, 84% do not think Scotland's councils are actually local, which is interesting. We'll take that poll again at the end and see where we are with it. So, okay, let's start off then by speaking to Dennis Holm, who's joining us. Now, you're not in Tórshavn. Where are you tonight in the Faroes, Dennis?
Yeah, hi. I'm here in Suðuroy, on the southernmost island of the Faroes. We are 18 islands, and I'm sitting here in beautiful Vágur. Should definitely visit it sometime, especially when the weather is as it has been today and tonight.
It'll never be like that when I get there, Dennis. I have that effect on places that it was always good weather the day before I arrive, but maybe not with you. Now, we're actually hopefully going to show some pictures here. This is part of a PowerPoint you'd sent us, because I don't know how many people, that would have been an interesting poll actually, to see how many people have been to the Faroes, but my guess is not too many. So now here's just a few that will, just, if you could talk through this, Dennis, this will give us just the beginnings of an idea of where you are. And you, of course, I should have introduced you properly. You're an educational lecturer in the Department of History and Social Science at the University of the Faroes. But relevantly for this, although your academic experience will come in too, but you were mayor of Vágur, this small town on Suðuroy, which you were mayor there from 2014 to 2020, during which time some very big things happened. But start off by just showing us a little bit about the island.
Yeah, this is the town where I live in Vágur. and it's a town that lies with a fjord, of course. But many places in the Faroes, we have these beautiful cliffs that you may also know from some places in Scotland. So many of the places in the Faroes, we are all close to the sea, and these great ground nature is part of places and part of people and part of being Faroese. So I'm actually sitting right here by the fjord right now, and the weather is something like this, I think. And this is originally an old fisheries town. In the southernmost part of the Faroes, we were really close to fishing grounds when we did not have motorized boats and so on. So we had people that were really skilled and taking advantage of that. So this was really a fishing town for more than 150 years or something like that. But that has all changed now because of changes in the fisheries, centralizing of the licenses and the fisheries plants and so on. So this is no more a fisheries town; it's more a town based on the experience economy, you could say.
Let's take this through to the next one, because this gives, for everyone who hasn't been to the Faroes, this gives us, if we can see the next slide, it gives us an idea of where your island is within the Faroes.
Yeah.
Oops. There we are.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, this is where the Faroes are. You have maybe as our next neighbors, you should probably know where the Faroe Islands are, but not all know that. But we are in the midst of the North Atlantic, north of Scotland, west of Norway, and in between Norway, Iceland, and Scotland. And of course, being in the midst of the North Atlantic, we are connected to our neighbors via airplane or via ferries, and of course freight transport to the next door neighbor. So we are actually, it's possible to fly from the Faroes to Edinburgh, for example. But we are definitely a periphery in Europe, you could say. And if you look at if you put on the next slide, you can get a closer picture of the Faroe Islands. We are 18 islands. We have the airport on this island to the west, and most of the Faroe Islands are today connected by subsea tunnels. And we are also opening a subsea tunnel to this island, Sandøy, within next year in 2023. So actually, of the larger islands, we are the only island that is connected by boat. So we have a ferry connection to Tórshavn, the capital, which takes 2 hours, and it goes something like 2 days, two times a day, sometimes 3 times a day. So it's not possible for us to commute to the good jobs in Tórshavn or in the main area. And that also means that we have had a really strong growth area around the capital. The urbanization of the Faroes is also really visible, while the other places, like, for example, Suðuroy and also Sandøy, we have had some difficulties, declining population and so on. But we are getting better and better now because of the economic times in the Faroes are doing real good. To the discussion when it comes to municipalities or local councils, you see a map of the island here on the right side. And even though we are only 4,600 people on the island, we have 7 municipalities. So we have several local councils that all have their local democracy, ranging from 3 members in the local council to 9 here in Vágur. And all of the local councils, they have their local tax base. So also the very small one of Hov and Famjun, where there only live 80 people, they also have their own local council and their own local tax base. And this, of course, gives some opportunities that they have some money to make investments locally, do projects locally, and so on. But we all know that one main part of being a municipality is that you are providing services for your inhabitants, for your local people, and that's also the case in the Faroes, that we provide services like kindergarten. We do the school buildings. Municipalities do the school buildings. We also provide services for the elderly, and also for child protection and the technical area, planning, fire department, and so on. So we have a lot of services that we provide to the inhabitants. And in the Faroes, we have crashed these difficulties with small municipalities. If you're too small to run your own home for the elderly, we will do it together. So we are actually running the elderly service for the island together, all municipalities. Some of the municipalities, they're too small to run their own kindergarten, or they're only on kindergarten yet, and then they are buying the services from our next door, the next neighbor, the larger neighbor. So we are really using the opportunities of doing stuff together and cooperating around the services that we provide to the people. Fire protection is another issue that is divided to each half part of the island where we run it together. So even though you are really small, you can still provide really good services to your people, your local inhabitants.
Dennis, we'll come back. I'm sure there's some obvious questions beginning to rise in people's minds. And I should say, just use the chat, people, if there's questions you want to ask Dennis. The sooner you get them in, the sooner we can, be processing them as we're going along. Just a quick, obvious one is, the mindset from here would look at an island with 4,000 people and 7 councils, which has to cooperate anyway to produce something like an old folks' home, and say, you guys are crazy. Why don't you just become one big, small for us, tiny? It would still be tiny council.
Yeah, of course, that debate has also been here in the Faroes, that some politicians from the Faroese parliament, they would like that the municipalities were amalgamated, that they were merged into larger municipalities. But there were we had this general not election, but voting in 2012 about if we should amalgamate municipalities, if we should merge them. And in general, it was a big no, because people really like to have their own small local democracy, so that you can have an influence on what's happening in your local area. And we really see that in many places now, that the economy is doing okay, or doing good in the Faroes actually, and the economy in the most of the municipalities is also doing good. And this means that also small municipalities have more and more money to do stuff for the local inhabitants. And we see that, for example, the Sumpa, the southernmost town here in Suðuroy, they only have something like 330 people in their municipality, and they have made huge investments in playgrounds in their local town cultural house and so on, because they all have their own tax base. If the island was one municipality, I'm sure that the amount of money they have used in providing services and opportunities for the local people would not have been made there, because the larger council said it's crazy to use so much money in a small village.
But how do 300 people contribute enough to make services possible? Is there a general pooling system for all the councils by the Faroese government, or?
No, all the Faroese town council, we are allowed to collect municipal taxes, and the municipal taxes, they go from something like 22% it's income tax, 22% in the highest tax rate in the Faroes, and maybe down to 16% in some of the small ones. Besides the income tax, we also get part of the company taxes. So many of the small municipalities, Sumpa, for example, has something like, I think they have something like maybe 1.5 million euros a year in their local budget, and they're only 330 people, and they don't owe any money, or don't have any larger debt to pay. They have a school that's in good shape and so on. So they really have the opportunity of doing stuff for the locals in the towns and villages that belong to the municipality.
Okay, this is amazing. And I can see some chat questions coming in. But as long as we have this PowerPoint, we have you in a tiny little box, Dennis, which is not where we want you to be. So let's move through this PowerPoint quickly so that we can get you in full vision. Let's see the next slide, Dan.
Yeah, this was shortly. I mentioned this, that Suðuroy, the island of Suðuroy, was historical, the main growth area in the Faroes, the main driver of the Faroese economy. Now we're talking something like 110, 20 years ago. And of course, people know the history and are really proud of that. But Suðuroy has had a decline in population for several years because of the urbanization in the Faroes. So it's been difficult to work with that, but I think we see some changes now that Surrey is also doing better and better, not as growing as fast as the Faroe Islands in general. You can take the next slide. Yeah, this gives a picture of what happened in Surrey historically. Because of the fisheries, we were the main growth area in the Faroes. People were moving to Surrey because of the job opportunities in fish and fisheries, and also services on land. Because of the high economic growth in Surrey, we got a lot of rich families, and they had servants and so on. But then the economy changed because of the crisis also on Wall Street, hit also Faroes, and the advantages we had being close to good fishing grounds, they were not so relevant anymore because of the engines coming into boats and so on. So we were actually bypassed by most of the area up north. So that actually for like 70 years or something like that, we have had a declining population on Surrey, because people are getting educated and they are seeking jobs in the larger towns, in Tórshavn mainly, public administration and in private services and commercial services also. So we were in a difficult situation here in Surrey and in Vágur in 2012 when I joined politics. I became mayor in 2013. Just take the next slide. And we really needed to do something. And one thing that we did is that we changed our focus. We started to work on the growth sector, and one of the main areas, the main economies that were in a big growth in 2012 and still is in big growth is the experience economy, which is both within tourism and within in sports and so on. And this guy, Paul Johansson, he was a local swim hero. He won the silver medal in the Euro Championship in 2010. He was training in a 25-meter pool and competing in a 50-meter pool. And this commentator on Eurosport in August 2010 said, "Build that man a pool and name it after him." And so we did actually start a crazy project locally. We were a group that started a project and soon got all of the town involved. And this energy that a town has is quite impressive, and that's why I think this idea about local democracy is really good and really strong, because when you have a local democracy and a local tax base, you really can do crazy stuff.
Okay, so Dan, just scroll through now. These are the pictures of the you'll see at the beginning. You cannot look at that. Yeah, I cannot believe that.
And we got this building ground from the municipality. I wasn't part of the town council at that point, and we got fundings, a gift from a company that had connection to the town to start a foundation, and then we just started to build, and people just started to join in, both giving money to the building, but also helping it. So people, these are sailors on the left that were working abroad, that when they were home, they helped for free. And to the right, people also helped to prepare the ground for free and so on. So this crazy idea with the building a 50-meter pool soon became a town's project. And everybody's project. Everybody could join in and help. And even when people were home in the summer holiday, they helped preparing the opening day, ground opening in October 2015. And of course, we had a huge party with Paul Johansson being the first swimmer to join in. So actually, we are a town of 1,370 people, and we actually have a 50-meter swimming pool. Probably the smallest place in the world that has a 50-meter swimming pool. We also have an indoor football arena. We have a sports high school and so on, because we have focused really hard on developing the experience economy locally.
And this has sorry to interrupt, Dennis, but I think that's the last slide. So we could end it there, Dan?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this has also changed the way the economy here is. If you go back to 2012, we had something like 250 jobs within fisheries. Today we have 10. But we have created a vast number of new jobs within the experience economy, within the sports high school, restaurants, and hotels, and Airbnbs, and so on. So we have really created an economy within the experience economy by using the opportunity that a local democracy and a local tax base has.
And just because this is being quite modest, just having looked through the rest of the PowerPoint you sent me, but it's quite a long one. You've got something like a 485% increase in the number of beds for tourists in that period in 7 years. You've got a new campsite. You've got the sports high school that looks absolutely fantastic with for 48 kids. It looks like there's room for boarding as well. You'll see at the very beginning of the chat, I put a link into the website that shows you more about that. You've got digital nomads there. You've got a digital artist in residence. You've got a new project in residence in the Arctic, where you're looking for Scottish island partners potentially.
Yeah.
We'll come back to this because I'm sure people will want to know more about it. But you mentioned the ferry connection between Suðuroy and Scotland, and you tried to restart it just before COVID, and it didn't work.
Yeah.
What I hesitate to ask, but what went wrong?
What went wrong? Mainly, I think, the lack of investors, lack of money. We had on a ferry operating from Suðuroy to Scrapster in the 1970s, 80s, and up to the 1995. It was closed down because of political discussions. It's a long story, but it was closed down. But we have since here on Suðuroy discussed that it's really stupid that we don't have a ferry connections to our next door neighbors. We have a flight to Edinburgh that goes twice a week during a part of the year, not all year, but we don't have a ferry connection, and it's only 12 hours ferry. So we started that also because of Faroe Islands has become a really interesting tourist destination, and we saw it as an opportunity to get access to a mainland with something like 80 million people living there, or 70 million people living in the UK, accessing maybe Suðuroy. So we saw it as an opportunity. Yeah.
It's brilliant because there's you in Suðuroy, which you've got, as you said, you have basically 1,400 people, and you've taken the initiative on a ferry route, which Scotland with 5.4 million people hasn't. But anyway, that's a brief sketch over everything, people. I don't know if it's possible for everyone to keep all of this in their minds, but just while you're getting your mind focused, hopefully, on the Faroese idea, we're going to play in a different perspective that you'll discover is actually strangely very similar, but from a different country. The Faroes is still a very, very devolved part of Denmark. It has truly the world's most powerfully devolved parliament. But Norway, which is also a kind of close neighbour, also has famously extremely devolved local councils and very powerful ones. So I spoke earlier to the local government minister, who wasn't able to kind of come in and join us now at 7 p.m, but I'm still pretty impressed he joined us at all. His name is Ole Gustaf Narud, and he's the state secretary. You'll hear him introduce himself with his in kind of accent up for his name, a lot better than my one. When Dan plays this video in, it'll go to the full screen. So basically, if you're trying to screen around with anything else and look at your email at the same time, you'll find it doesn't work. So basically, I'm here to say to you, don't fiddle, right? Don't fiddle. Just watch the man. And remember, whilst you're watching this, because he comes in with statistics right at the beginning, you have to get the compare and contrast in your mind ready here. Scotland has 32 local councils. So here we go. And Dan, hit the button.
My name is Ole Gustav Narud, and I'm a state secretary in the Norwegian Ministry of Local Government and Regional Development.
Right. And we're really pleased to have this chance to have a conversation with you, because in Scotland, we're going through more local elections, which are actually not local by anyone's definition anywhere else, practically in the developed world. But looking particularly at our closest Nordic neighbour, which is Norway, our North Sea cousins. How many, you've got the same population roughly. How many municipal councils do you have?
Presently, we have 356 local municipal councils, and the number of inhabitants vary from around 1,000 in the smallest municipalities up to 600,000 in Oslo.
Right, and on top of that, you actually have what we would call county councils as well.
On top of that, there are county councils. Oslo is both a municipal and county in one organization. We have presently 11 counties. It used to be 18, and it will increase again. So we will have 15 in a couple of years. This is an ongoing discussion.
Yes, because the Conservative government that recently ruled Norway and had done a deal with the Progress Party pushed through mergers of municipalities, of councils, in the name of efficiency and better governance. And it seems that actually a lot of that is now being reversed.
There is a reversal happening just now. It became one of several topics in the last election campaign. And as a result, you got a new government, and the new government is restoring several of these county councils and even some of the municipal councils. So there's a kind of a backlash, I think the Conservatives would call it.
Yeah, and actually very few councils in any case did merge.
There was a very, very long and strong discussion about this, and there's a limited number of municipalities that merged. I think we had approximately 200 popular votes in these municipalities. And in most cases, the popular vote was against the merging. So the typical decision was thank you, but no. But there were a few municipalities who did merge. So there was a reduction in the number of municipalities from, I think it was 427 down to 356.
But in comparison to Scotland, which I have been shocking you with, in terms of yes. Our average size, you gave yours from sort of 1,000 to 600,000 is Oslo. Our average council is 175,000 people, which is, is that local?
That's not local anymore. The size, the geographical size and the number of people are so big that it's you don't get the benefits of local democracy.
And just because people here will have forgotten what those benefits are, what are they in the Norwegian view?
Well, the main benefit is that you can influence your own future, the future of your own local community. It's important for a family or for a person to have influence on the development of their own municipalities, because that in turn affects the quality of your school, the value of your home, and so on. So local influence on the development of the society is important. And it also is important because you want to have support for and trust in politics. You want people to have trust in democracy. And I think that if you have a large number of people who have the experience of being a local politician, then there is also a large part of the population who understands better how the welfare state works. If you have a limited number of politicians, and these politicians on top of that are full-time professional politicians, then there is a distance between the voter and the politician, and that's not very healthy.
You are your own example of that, because you ran a small municipality as mayor in East Norway, and you were actually also, were you at the same time able to continue your job even as mayor, as an academic, or did you have to give up that job?
While I was a mayor, I had to give up the job as an academic. But the rules in Norway are so that after a period or two as a mayor, I can go back to my job at university. So I didn't risk anything.
And is that true for the private sector as well as the public?
Formally, yes. But of course, in the private sector, there is a dynamic development of business and so on. You can't have a law that says that your business is going to be there when you go back, because the business may be gone. So if you're a small businessman, running your own company or your own farm or whatever, then this is a little bit more tricky.
But let's take the average councillor who isn't a mayor. Do they get paid?
They have a benefit, but they have no. It's very unusual that they are part-time or full-time politicians. You get a compensation for your effort, but it's a big point that it's a limited compensation.
So here, I think councillors get £13,000 a year, and people are arguing for more. But sometimes they are covering areas the size of small countries as their wards. Is that the answer, or is that what begins to happen when the councils are too big?
Well, when the councils get too big, then you lose something that's very important, namely you have to know the society that you are serving. You have to know the problems that you are supposed to be solving, and people have to know you. It's very important that there's a short distance between the voter and the politician. And if the politicians generally are unknown to the people, and they doesn't know very much about the municipalities or the local towns and so on that they are serving, then you get another policy. That's not good for the result.
Do you hold your council meetings during the day or in the evening?
Typically, it's in the evening. In a municipality like the one I was mayor, and where I've been a local politician for 30 years, the meetings are in the afternoon on Wednesday, typically. And that's because it's supposed to be possible for you to have an ordinary job and a family life and still be a councillor. And
still get home. I mean, in Scotland, it can take 2 days or 3 days public transport to get to your local council headquarters. But your municipalities, even the ones in the Arctic, are so that you shouldn't spend that amount of time travelling.
No, I've been up in Finnmark and visited some municipalities up there, and it might be a 2 or 3 hour drive from one end to the other end of the municipality, but that's really big municipalities. Well, typically you can go home and there's no inconvenience in being a councillor. And that's a very important point, because if you can get home easily after a meeting and they don't have to therefore be during the day because you don't spend the whole day travelling, it means you can keep your job. It's still going to be quite a push to be a councillor, but you can keep your job and be a councillor in the evening. Of course, yes, that's very important. So other things that people worry about is if there is a very poor area and it must manage all sorts of services, how does it manage when it doesn't have wealthy people to contribute a lot of income for that council? The councils in Norway have transfers from the national government. And there's also a system of transferring tax incomes between the municipalities. Because most of the services of the welfare state, care for the elderly, schools, kindergartens, and so on, it's actually financed by the government, by the welfare state, and the monies are transferred in different ways back to the municipalities to make it possible for them to give these services. So the poor areas don't lose out? No, they don't lose out. Remember, a lot of the people who now live in the rich areas, they were brought up, they were born in the poorer areas, and their parents and their family still live in this poorer area. And then it's, in my opinion, it's just common sense that those who moved away are participating in giving welfare to those who stayed behind. If you think about it as your own parents, you want your own parents to have a decent care in the end of their life. And of course, you're supposed to contribute and pay your taxes so that it is possible. That's common sense, in my opinion. Yes, I would agree. But in Scotland, it's such a long time since people lived on the land. They were cleared off it such a long time ago. And it's owned by so large landowners that there isn't the same degree of going backwards and forwards to a home
in the country, and sometimes that's a difficulty.
You have a history that's rather brutal, and it's very different from what we've had in Norway. The land ownership and so on has been centralized in Scotland, while as in Norway, the typical landowner is a small, often part-time farmer. So who owns the land, who owns the resources, is of course also important in the development of a society. If you have big differences between those who have and those who haven't, as you have in Britain, then there is less confidence in the system, less willingness to contribute, and so on. And you get more political conflicts.
And I suppose the other thing is that those farmers who were the very grounding of the Norwegian society and the new Norwegian state, they didn't want to have a new country where control was all in Oslo. So they passed a Municipalities Act to make sure that power stayed local.
Even in the Viking era, say 1,000 years ago, the farmers they owned their land and they had the power to unseat the king. So the Norwegian Viking kings typically were kind of elected, not in a democratic fashion, not that everybody had one vote and so on, but they were dependent on some kind of acceptance from the local farmers and the local stakeholders. And then this has been a tradition all through our history. We've found that there is a need for local adjustments, also because after all, there is a limited budget. You have to make some tough decisions every now and then. If you want to have a new school, well, then you won't have a new nursing home. And these decisions should be made locally. If they want to invest in schools, then they may not be able to invest in nursing homes, and that's for the local voters to decide.
And I've seen some examples. I'm thinking of Ålesund, where there was a whole tunnel network developed to connect the city to the islands, where the council chose to put money into that and put a toll on roads to raise money from its people and got some matched money from central government. And it was able to change the economy of those islands completely.
That's right, and that's a rather good example, in my opinion. If the politicians and the population in that area decides that they don't need this kind of infrastructure, well, then they don't get it. If they want to have it, they may have to contribute, for instance, through local taxes or to paying for using the roads and so on. Tolls.
But the big argument in Scotland seems to be the presumption that big is beautiful, that big is efficient, and that you can have economies of scale, that old one, where a big council can make big purchasing decisions, and that pulls down the costs for everybody of the services that it uses. So what's the answer to that with having so many small? How does a council of 1,000 people honestly run even the directors of education that get paid a huge amount? How does that all work with a tiny municipality?
In a small municipality, they probably won't have a full-time administrator looking after the schools. It will be a part-time job, typically a job that you do while you are also teaching. Even in my municipality, we had 4 schools, and 2 of these schools were so small that the job of being the leader was a part-time job, and the rest of the person was doing ordinary teaching tasks. If you are giving services to the old and sick, there is a very limited economics of scale. And remember, if economics of scale was the only economic mechanism, then you would have only monopolies. A big municipality is actually a monopoly. There is no competition, no comparing, no dynamics actually. And the theory of monopolies is that it's both expensive and poorer quality. So if you want to kind of discuss what is the perfect size of municipality and so on, you have to consider that it's not only economics of scale, but there is also the problem of monopoly power. So you need competition, you need smaller units.
How do you manage a hospital? If you're a municipality of 1,000 people, you won't have enough people to justify having a hospital yourself.
It used to be run by the counties. So it's not a municipal decision to run a hospital. It was the counties who used to have it. After the government nationalized it, the number of people employed in all kind of administrative jobs have grown rapidly, actually. The smallest municipalities will typically have some kind of cooperation with neighboring municipalities on, say, technical services, waste management, maybe even if there's short distance water management and so on. Running buses and trains and whatever is also typically done by several municipalities together. The difference between a municipality and an ordinary business is that it's easier for a municipality to cooperate with a neighboring municipality, whereas if these are businesses, it may not even be allowed to cooperate.
That's a really good point. But then would people not come in and say, look, if you 4 neighboring municipalities are all cooperating all the time, why don't you just become one big municipality? Was that what the Conservatives said?
That's just what the Conservatives said. They said that these municipalities, they cooperate a lot. And all this cooperation is a problem because the local councillors aren't able to control the cooperation. In my opinion, that's not true because the number of services that you cooperate with other municipalities on making are, after all, they are limited and they get a lot of attention. The local politicians, they are watching what are these other municipalities and what are we producing and how is it working, and they have an opinion on it. Often they are more interested in these services than the services that they themselves have the full responsibility for. So it's a complex picture, but to say that because municipalities are cooperating, there should be kind of forced into a union is wrong in my opinion.
So really, you keep the political control in the municipalities. Even if people cooperate together, you still keep the political control at the small level.
Certainly. That's much of the point. The laws and the regulations are so that it's supposed to be to remain in local control. But of course, if you are cooperating with somebody, investing in waste management, for instance, then it's not for you just to leave the cooperation. It's regulated. So you are. It's like if you invest in a school, then the school is there. You can't change your mind. This is done, and you have to complete it for a number of years. Most of these issues where you are cooperating with other municipalities are things where there are economics of scale and where you do the investment because it's economically sound. It's kind of smart.
So finally, what would you say to Scotland then with our structure? I know as a Norwegian, you probably would never presume to say anything to any other country about how they run their things. But I mean, I know when we spoke before, you were quite shocked really at the size of what we're working with here. What are we missing?
Well, you are losing out in a sense because most people would gladly contribute to developing their own municipality, their own local town, their own local island, and so on, if they were given the instruments to participate. I think that the benefits outweighs the costs. It's very important that you try to run your country so that everybody who can and will participate has a possibility to contribute to the development of the country. The history of Norway is a history where local municipalities started building roads and power plants and so on, and developing industries. And they also gradually developed schools and social services. And then in the end, this was kind of nationalized so that it became national policy. It's a way, historically, a way of developing the whole country, where people who are living out in the country participates and creates something that becomes national policy over time. So that's what you're missing out. You're not exploiting the full strength of the population, the full what do you call it, the potential of the population. That's not good. You should try.
Agreed.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for that. That's a tremendous insight. And I know there's much more we could talk about. But thank you so much for your time, Ole. And we'll see what Scots make of your words.
We'll see. Thank you anyway. It was very, very interesting to be interviewed.
Well, that was, I must say, I was quite gobsmacked by all of that. And I hope you were too, listening. Just let's begin to open up now to other speakers. But just before we do that, I just wonder, when you were listening to that, Dennis, I know you have just organised a conference in the Faroes, because in fact, one speaker we were looking for was at your conference, so we couldn't have him. So you've been busy on this front. But does that, it seems to be such a similar outlook from Norway. And really, I mean, it's a shame in a way that we had recorded Ole, so you couldn't see the shock on his face when I told him, the size of our councils. Do you feel some of the same?
Yeah, definitely. I think Ole's story was similar to my thinking of your way of running councils. Because if you look at the history, for example, in the Faroes, we have really, really small councils, and if you want to look at the development in a local area, you want to, in some ways, to look at what is the trend in society and how can people participate in as Ole also mentioned, that in creating a good life in the areas. And today we see that this new trend is emerging everywhere in the West, in the North Atlantic, all around in the North Atlantic, in Europe also, that people are again wanting to live in rural areas where there's a great nature, where there's peace and quiet. They want control of their time and control of their life and so on. And this really brings to life the local councils, because when people move to a small place, we have the same story as in Norway. People really can make a difference if you come to a small place. But if you live in a small place where we have 2 days travel to the local council, then you don't. It's impossible to make a difference. So I agree to his shocking with the large municipalities that you have, or large councils you have in Scotland. Yeah.
And just the example that we looked at there of education, where he said that a director of education in a small municipality is very often a teacher. Is that the same with you?
Yeah, the various municipalities, we don't run the school buildings, we don't run the schools themselves. But for example, regarding care for the elderly, some places that we have directors for care for the elderly that are both directors and also do work in care. So it's not just that we have an administrative post, but we have people that are really flexible in our systems.
But I imagine that also has the advantage that you're, as we would say, keeping your hand in. I mean, you're you're basically very close to the sharp face of whatever service you're providing if you're actually working in it, delivering it.
Yeah, the main discussion about bigger municipalities is that you want to have systems that can control everything and so on. But in a small municipality, you really don't need a big system to control everything because people are so close to each other. And if there is something wrong at the home for the elderly here in our town, people that are either living there or working there or relatives, they will let us know right away so that we can change what they think is wrong. We don't need a system to control it.
Right. Well, let's bring in Mike Danson at this moment. Mike, can you appear? And I just wonder what you're thinking as you hear all this. And I'm noticing as well, I'm looking through the chat, and actually there are some specific questions, but quite a lot of people are, and of course it's invariably to the Norwegian who is not here. I'm seeing the one question from Kenneth. Does Norway have a national legal framework defining how municipalities can cooperate? Or do different councils simply cooperate as they think necessary? Well, actually, you can answer that, Dennis, since you are here. Do you have rules about how you cooperate, or do you just get on with it?
Yeah, in some areas we have rules regarding, for example, the care for the elderly. We have rules how we cooperate, and also within the child protection area we have rules how we cooperate. But in other areas, for example, within the kindergarten and so on, we just find out. We do it together and solve the problems together, and typically with the larger municipalities providing services to a smaller one. So it's, and we also have, for example, in this part of the island, we have together a health house where we have doctors and dentists and so on, where 4 municipalities together own the health house, and it's just run by common sense. It's not a big set of rules.
Boy, I could imagine four sets of people really falling out over who pays what for that facility. You don't fall out at all?
No, we have made an arrangement that we pay in relation to to the population, and of course over time the population has changed. Some of the towns they have got smaller, some of the municipalities they've gotten bigger, and so on. And this is just an acceptance that we have, that we pay in relation to the population that each of the 4 municipalities have of the general expenses that we have. Yeah.
And there's another question from Dave Kidd. Which body manages housing, industrial developments, and planning? Who does that?
Yeah, in the Faroes, we run as the municipalities. They run planning, general town planning, where you want industrial areas, where you want housing, and so on. We also give people the acceptance to build a house. They have to come to the municipality and ask for the permission to build a house, and they will get that from the municipality. And also the general way of creating development, and also this also lies at the municipalities. That also means that a municipality has a really wide area of a wide ranges of areas that you can work in, that you want to create development. Some focus on fisheries, some focus on experience economy, some focus on creating a good community for children, children's families with children, and so on. And this is the way that the Norwegian minister also mentioned the competition between the local democracies, local councils.
Yeah. I'm going to take one more question and see if I can actually get the questioner to ask it himself, and then bring in Mike Danson, who's just waiting to come in. Tom Tubblety, are you there? And do you want to ask this question yourself? It's a good one.
Yes, thanks very much.
Let's see you, Tom.
All right, hang on.
Come on. Have you got a bonnet on or something?
No.
Right, there you go. Bonnets are okay, by the way.
No, the question I had for Norway, and I presume for Faroes too, to a certain extent, is our councils are dominated by large national parties. Does that filter down to municipalities when they're the size of what they are in Norway or Faroes? Because if it does, I think one of the reasons why we don't get cooperation so willingly and so readily in our councils is because the big national parties tell them what they can and can't do. Who will cooperate with whom is a big issue at the moment in the upcoming local council elections. So I just wondered, when you get down to that sort of size, whether these national parties have the same kind of influence that they do here.
Dennis?
In the Faroes, we have in the largest municipalities we have the national parties that they run also for the election for councils, for municipal councils. But in the smaller municipalities, we don't have that. But we don't have this national agenda that we have the parties that work together on the national level, that they also demand that you work together on local level. Don't have that. It's just in some of the smaller areas, not the larger areas. We have that the election is arranged by the parties, so that the parties they help getting people listed so that you can run the election and so on. But in most places we don't have that. Also in larger municipalities we don't run with the political parties.
Thank you.
I think actually in Norway they do actually have political parties in quite a lot of areas, although the ones that I know best are the cities. And actually you'd have to say about Norway, this was a point that the minister made, that the cities in all the Nordic countries are the same size as our huge councils here. It's not the cities that are ever different. And if you realise that, it makes the average council even weirder actually in Scotland, because it's the likes of St Andrews, Pennycook, Oban, Selkirk, these towns that don't run themselves, and islands, Barra, Mull, Skye, all of them in any other country would have their own council. That's the size that would be their own council. And actually quite a lot, I remember being in Stavanger and meeting an 18-year-old lad who was actually a councillor there. He was also the Secretary of Labour Youth. And actually, he was on Utoya with that terrible incident with Breivik. So I was in touch with him again recently. Well, not that recently now, after it, to make sure he was all right. And that they see that as very important, because the national politics is created by lots of local versions of that political outlook. So that it isn't that there's some national outlook called Labour that sits high in the sky. It's actually created by lots of very practical people, and nearly all of their the top people in these democracies have come through being very, very engaged in a local council, which I would have thought is pretty good. So this question always arises whether or not there's an absence of parties, and that's what makes it all so hunky-dory. It's very often not that at all. It's a different outlook of cooperation instead of just the grindingness that we seem to experience as normal. Now, I'm seeing two hands up. Poor Mike's never going to get a word in edgeways. Mike, are you there?
Yes.
Yeah. Mike, did you want to just respond before we take Joe and Flo? Joe and Flo, boy, it rhymes. Anybody else that's got a name that rhymes with Joe and Flo, you can come in on that one as well. But Mike, what do you think of what you've heard so far?
All very interesting. You put in the chat about that Jimmy Reid Foundation report in 2012. It was actually a follow-up, 2020, by James Mitchell. And although that was looking in particular at devolution, it came up with a lot of very similar elements and such. So the principles were very similar. Local democracy is important. There's a democratic deficit. What that paper argued for was a layer of democracy below the council level. So it wasn't talking about getting rid of our councils. It was talking about having democratic decision making at the level below the existing councils, keeping the bureaucracy we have at the current time, so gaining economies of scale and so on. Interesting, we've got multi-member constituencies in council areas. Often the councillors will meet locally to make local decisions. They have small budgets. So the question is, are we that far away from, in some aspects, from these models in Norway and the Faroes and so on? That'd be one question put up. Another would be that, there's arguments, particularly in Highlands, and the Highlands isn't the whole of Scotland. So when you say it can take a day or two to get home from a council meeting, that's not true for the vast majority of the population. But for Highlands and Islands, there are additional issues, and probably Argyll. Councillors, people in Caithness recently were saying we need to break up Highland region, it's far too big. Councillors on Skye said, no, we don't want that. We want a bit more control over budgets for Skye, but we don't want to lose, they didn't put it in these terms, but the cross-subsidisation from Inverness and such. We need to have the expertise at the higher level. The community wealth building has become a big thing in Scotland. It's challenging this idea of economy of scale because a lot of public procurement, which came in particularly under Gordon Brown as Chancellor and the Labour government in the UK, actually forced through a belief in huge economies of scale, so that schools would have to purchase collectively, and not only for a council area, but for bigger than a council area, several councils together. Regardless of the long-term wider economic impacts that might have on the local economy, because you might actually be better off having a local supply chain and so on. And the other big change that Gordon Brown brought in, of course, was PFI, Private Financial Initiative, so that managing your local school is not in the hands even of the Education Authority, because they're so tied up in the conditions that the investors in the school impose from the outset. So they can't even let the school out for local clubs and parties and so on, because PFI owners would put such a huge amount of money demand for that rent. So there's a lot of subtleties, contexts, which both of the other speakers mentioned. Punchline of an old joke is, we wouldn't start from here. We're not starting from where the Nordic countries are. We're starting from a very centralised economy and society, where there isn't a lot of trust between the different levels. And I'll finish on this, but what we do know from looking at the community buyouts and development trusts across Scotland, very small communities in Scotland have been able to turn themselves around when they're trusted, when they're given the powers, when there's land reform and so forth. So a series of issues there to hopefully to make us think on. Now, Flo and Joe.
Yep. Okay. Thanks for that, Mike. Right. Let's just take a couple of questions. Flo said she put her hand up by mistake. Flo, come on. You're the only woman that's going to ask a question, so I might just still hope that you might do that. I'm not trying to be hostile to the gentleman here, but we have quite a man-heavy thing going on here. So come on, girls, let's have a few questions, please. Right, Joe Gorman, go for it.
I just wanted to answer Tom's question about whether local politics is actually still dominated by party politics. I live in a municipality with about 12,000 people, so that is pretty small by Scottish standards.
Joe, whereabouts? Sorry,
it's a place called Malvik, which is outside of Trondheim. So Trondheim is a big city by Norwegian standards, and Malvik is just its neighbour, but like about 12,000 people. And it's very much dominated by party politics, I would say. It isn't this utopia of a very local feeling. In all the discussions in the local newspaper is, we're going to vote the Labour Party, the Tories, the Greens, whatever. So I would say that isn't any different to Scotland, at least in this place. Maybe in much smaller ones, like what Dennis was talking about, you get a completely different dynamic. And I also just wanted to point out something. If I, from my experience of having living in both countries, I've lived half my life in Norway and half in Scotland, I feel that in Norway, and this is just my own feeling, there's a greater local identity amongst the people. And what Dennis was talking about of people, and Ola rather was talking about people still having contact with where they grew up, I think that happens more here. So here I live in Malvik, and I know some families whose surname is Malvik. And why is that? Because they've lived here, forever. I grew up in Coatbridge in Scotland. I never met a Mr. and Mrs. Coatbridge. So, that kind of summarizes the difference for me. And I think that maybe is one of the things that influences at a fundamental level, that people want to be more local. And of course, there's the geography and climate in both Faroes and Norway that forces people to stay where they are historically. And I think that has also been an influence. But this is just me speculating, but that's how it feels to me.
Joseph, those are all all good points. I'm just seeing other questions here. In fact, it was John Bryden who also wanted to come in. John is, well, I'm never quite sure where John is actually, but happily he's nearly always with us. John, where are you?
I'm in Denmark.
Right.
Rural Denmark.
Hello there. You're both there.
Hi, Liz. No, I mean, this is a very interesting discussion, and thank you for bringing the issue back on the table, because it's so important for the future of Scotland. And of course, our histories in Scandinavia and Scotland are completely different. And we have a different trajectory. It's worth remembering that Wheatley was the one who really created these large councils to start with, Wheatley Commission, the Wheatley Report. And that was under the conditions of Scotland without a parliament. And it was, as I recollect, some kind of experiment. And it's interesting that that experiment was never adopted anywhere else in the UK. Scotland got left with it, but it was then adapted, of course, in several other reforms. But the structure, the large-scale structure, I think goes back to the Wheatley. I mean, after all, I think it was Andy said we had county councils, city councils, and all sorts of things before that. And we even had parish councils in the 1930s. They were abolished in the 1930s in Scotland. And they were quite important because they looked after school appointments, for example, the headmasters, the local schools, and so on and so forth. So they had powers. Parish. We hardly know where the parishes are now.
John, I'm sorry to interrupt. John, sorry to interrupt. It's lovely to see you, but you're distorted a little bit there. I wonder if perhaps if you came out of your video, your voice might, it might not disrupt so much.
Sorry, I don't want to take up too much time.
No, that's okay. Either. But listen, I wanted to ask you something. And I see Andy Whiteman, I hope, is still with us, actually. So let's see if we can get Andy in here as well. If I heard you rightly there was a bit of a whoa at the important point. Are you saying then that the decision to create essentially hyper big councils, unitary councils, was run through in Scotland and didn't take off in the rest of the UK? So yeah, we basically a bit like the poll tax. We have been, we've been done.
Yeah, that's how I remember it. And I was alive then. And
you're still alive, boy. But just importantly, for the discussion here, the Scottish government has the power to change this.
It does.
John.
It does. But it doesn't show much sign of it. Remember, we've had enormous transfers of power from the local governments since the Wheatley Commission to quasi-autonomous public bodies, quangos. We've had housing taken out of local authority control, more or less. We've had environment taken out. We've had all sorts of other things centralized in quangos or government. And that also carries jobs and funding with it. And our councils are very weak compared to the Scandinavian councils, very weak, both fiscally and in terms of dependence on central government funding and so on, and in terms of the powers that they have.
Well, let's bring, Andy's making a response to you here, so we might as well have him. Now, Andy is probably also coming to us from a wood somewhere in Lochaber. So I don't know if he can appear in vision. Can you, Andy? Or even sound?
Yes. Do you hear me?
Yes, a bit crackly.
Yeah.
Oh, look, there you are.
Oh, right. Okay, thanks. Thanks for putting on this event. Nice to hear from John. Yes, no, I'm
Andy,
just
sorry,
picking up John's.
there is quite a lot of interference, actually. Can you just take out your video? Can you?
Yeah, I've taken out the video now. Does that help?
Not much, actually, but anyway, fire away.
Okay. Okay, no, I'm just picking up John's point about the weekly being an experiment, and I just put a link to a blog looking at Berwick, for example. I mean, England has got lots of problems in its local government, but it never got rid of the local councils, which are still parish councils. Now, they don't have much power, but they never actually got rid of them, and that's the critical thing. As John said, we got rid of parish councils in the 1929 Act, but even then we were left with 430 councils, including 197 town ones, and they were got rid of, but they were not got rid of in England. I mean, there's work to be done on quite why the Scottish Office in the 60s wanted to basically abolish local government in Scotland. I've read a little bit about it, and indeed I put a quote on Twitter today from Jimmy Reid's rectorial address, which was given 50 years ago today, when he's famous for referring to the fact that we're not rats and we shouldn't participate in the rat race. But his whole lecture was about economic disempowerment, and he made a big play, in fact, that local councils were being abolished as he spoke. So I think it's really quite important it's important to remember that we've only had this state of affairs for a relatively short period in our history, since 1975. Prior to that, we were in the European mainstream. We had some of the earliest and the most powerful local councils in the royal boroughs in the 14th and 15th century, many of whose powers still exist on paper, but the administration that we had the powers doesn't exist anymore. So I think it's just important to have that perspective. And on the cooperation, I'll just finish on this point. It was interesting to hear from Faroes in Norway, because I went to Norway 15 years ago or so for a conference, and I was speaking to the chief executive of the local municipality, and it was at the time when the Scottish Parliament, so 10 years ago maybe, was centralising fire and rescue. And I asked him, how do you run a fire service in a small municipality of 2,500 people? And he said exactly what we've heard. We cooperate. And indeed, last year, he said there was a new tunnel built, and so a neighbouring municipality that had been part of a previous joint fire service, for example, they joined us because it was suddenly much, much easier for us to get our equipment to the mountain to them than it was when they found it previously. And this is the secret to small local government. What I call the Lego brick model is you cooperate for fire and rescue at a certain level. That's got certain parameters that determine what your cooperation might be, transport links and the rest of it. You cooperate on primary education, perhaps in a slightly different model. But if you don't have a small enough unit to begin with, you can't build anything out of Lego. The Lego pieces, if you just had 32 Lego pieces, you wouldn't be able to do much. With 300 Lego pieces, suddenly you can build things that are a little bit more imaginative. And so that's a really, really important point, because that's missed in the Scottish debate, where we talk about local authorities cooperating, but they're starting being really, really big. And the kind of cooperation we've seen attempted between, for example, Stirling and Clackmannan, which is still a very small council, haven't really worked. But finally, the fact that we do have Clackmannan Council, which is only 60,000 people, we have Orkney Islands Council, which is 21,000 people, shows that actually we still do have small local government that's more equivalent to Scandinavian local government, and broadly speaking, it works.
And Andy, just before you disappear into the buzzy darkness again, when you were a member of the Scottish Parliament, it's my impression from the outside that nobody's interested at all in this question, particularly about the scale of local government, that just looks like it's just a complexity too far. And after all, there was a pledge to reform the council tax by the SNP in 2007, which hasn't been honoured yet. So when we haven't even got round to discussing how to finance councils, it looks like the idea of actually discussing the size of them is just, parked for a decade or something. Did you get the feeling there was any interest by any political party in this issue?
Not really, no. I suppose the Greens, the Liberal Democrats, to an extent Labour, and the Conservatives, actually. The Conservatives, there was I sensed a feeling, and I think this feeling does exist, is that there is increasing centralisation. And typically, opposition parties feel that. Government doesn't feel that. But someone mentioned in the chat the National Care Service. And that is just the latest example. I mean, that's a massive raid on local authority competencies. And the politics of the current administration were well summed up by a quote that John Swinney gave at a committee. I was trying to find it, but I can't. Where he said that they were doing something that was basically telling local governments what to do. And he was saying that the problem is that there's widely different outcomes amongst different local authorities, and that's not acceptable. And I thought, well, if Boris Johnson were to say that there's widely different outcomes in health or education between the constituent devolved areas of the UK, and that's not acceptable, and he's going to impose his vision on what should happen, there'd be an outcry. So we have to get away from this language of postcode lotteries and complaining to the power above you when things go wrong and expecting them to fix it by fiat. You know, we have to restore faith in our local instruments, but that's not good either. I mean, I live in a ward where there's not going to be an election. The first time in my life, I won't actually go to the polls because there's not enough candidates.
This was something I wonder. Thanks, Andy. If Lily Hunter, come on, I'm just so keen to get another woman talking here. Lily, you've got a point as well about the lack of different, political colours, if you like, represented amongst the candidates. Can you ask that make that point, Lily Hunter?
My impression is that a number of the local candidates are running their own race, so to speak, and they have very little to do with the manifestos or the normal policies of the parties that they represent. And a lot of people around here in Caithness are afraid that some of these people would just sort of go independent after the election. So you'd be voting for one thing and getting something else. So that is a fear, if that's what you mean.
Yeah, but and your interest is you want to vote for a Green councillor, but there isn't one.
No, there isn't. I'm not sure there's one in Caithness anywhere. It's very hard to get people to stand for the elections up here.
Yeah, well, this was something I wanted to put back to Dennis actually, because Dennis, there's a statistic, I can't remember where I got it from, but in repeating it for about 10 years, nobody's contradicted it, which is that in Norway, 1 in 88 people stands for election for councils. In Scotland, it's 1 in 2,071. So we have basically far, far fewer people ever stand for election. And just to let you know, even though we have this time next week, we have our council elections, there are areas all over the place where there just aren't enough candidates to even cover. I mean, Andy's talking there about having no election in his ward because there are 3 places and there are 3 candidates. So that's it. They just all get elected. Do you have in the Faroes? Do you have competition? Is there quite vigorous elections, or does the same person tend to get elected over and over and over again?
No, actually, we have competition here, and actually we have something like 200 plus council members in the Faroes. So this local council election is really an important part of the Faroese democracy, where people are challenging the seats for the council all over, and we have something like 200 people are elected, and I don't have to remember the count from the last election, but I guess we have something like 500 to 600 people running for the councils each time, and this is an important part of local democracy, but it's also the foundation for the national democracy, because you really teach people to become politicians in the small councils and run for national government. And you can see the importance of the Faroese council election, because we have a voters' participation that runs from 80 to 90% in most places. And this is really, I think, probably the top scorers in Scandinavia and maybe in the western part of the world. So we really think that this local democracy is an important part of our society.
Now, there's a question actually to you that's a bit connected to this from Neil Robb. Neil, can you come in and ask it?
Oh, hi. The camera. Hi, Dennis. Hi, and hi, Lesley. Yeah, certainly. So, obviously, at the beginning, it's all about, you talked about the different tax kind of regimes in different municipalities. So people live here, they pay X amount of tax, most of that or some of that stays here. The rest goes central. And I don't know if it was the person talking from Norway that says the central money then comes back for primary services, such as schools and things like this. So how does that work specifically, if that makes sense?
Yeah. In the Faroes, when you work in the Faroes, you typically pay something like we have this Scandinavian standard of taxes, so we have a high income tax. Generally, we pay something like 45% of our salary in taxes, and most municipalities have something like 20 to 21% of income tax. That means that all the people that live in a municipality, they pay something like 20 to 21% of their income as a tax for the local council. And that's the way the system works in the Faroes. We don't have any transfer from the central government to the municipalities. We don't have a system where the richer municipalities have to pay to the poorer municipalities, as we have, for example, in Denmark and in Norway. So it's all about income taxes and about company taxes.
So that's corporation tax. Does that also go to the local council?
Yeah, the corporate tax in the Faroes is divided into two. The municipalities that have, for example, if we take here in Warburg, we have a salmon company here. They pay 30% of their corporate tax to the local municipality and 70% to the government. So so it's divided between the government and the municipalities.
And if I'm a taxpayer, do I have two separate bills? Do I pay one bill to my local council, one bill to Tórshavn, or do I pay Tórshavn and then they pay you? How does it work?
No, yeah, you pay. You don't. Of course, you don't feel it that you get a bill. It's just pulled off your salary when your salary is paid, and one bill goes to the municipality and one goes to the government. So it doesn't go around the government first. No. Right.
So you get directly your own cash.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which I think Karen in Norway is the same for Karen Riskard. Is that the same with Norway, that it goes directly to the municipalities?
Yeah, I mean, hi, I'm here with John. For both Norway, Denmark, Sweden, you have three types of taxes for the income taxes. A part going national level, one go to the regional, and one to the local level. And there's a maximum to the local level, and it's always on top. So it's around, I think, 18% or so of the total, which may be a 45, 50%, of which 18 is to local level, and then less to the regional and about the same to the national level. Then we also have in both Norway and Denmark, there's equivalent schemes. So the richer municipalities pay to the poorer ones, depending on the tax base they have. And that was, for example, changed in Denmark recently because there was a lot of unhappy rural municipalities that did not feel they had enough tax base. Of course, we've got problems without migration, too many old people, not enough young people, etc. Denmark also has property tax. All municipalities in Denmark have property taxes. So, which is in Norway, it's about half. I don't know if that helps, but tax is that's what matters, really. I mean, these.
And it's also the case then that over all of these examples, the thing that did happen in Scotland until recently, which was a council tax freeze, that was imposed by the Scottish government. You couldn't do that. You couldn't do that in Norway. The Norwegian government, the central government, couldn't tell a municipality here's how much you can raise your council tax, or here's how much you get. You can't change that.
No, I mean, you can go up to, I mean, it is ruled both in Denmark, Norway, and it's around 18% of these total 45, 50% sort of on average, which goes to the municipality. They can have lower, but they cannot have higher than that.
Okay, so there is a sort of agreed.
Yes,
that's agreed then that's imposed by central government, that proportion.
Yeah, there's and of course it's proportional, progressive taxes as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, instead of the council tax. Yeah. Thank you. I saw Mark briefly had his hand up. And sorry, Mark, I had your surname in my head for a minute and then it disappeared.
Sorry, that was just a mistake.
Well, you're here now. Anything you want to say about what you're hearing? No, Mark has taken very considerable fright. We had Vanessa who wanted to ask a question about finance earlier on. We're just coming to the end now, so don't sit in your hands, people. If there is specific questions, I'm trying to scroll through, but it's hard to do this and talk at the same time. Vanessa, do you have a question about finance?
Well, I'm always interested in how this works, and Karen has given an outline description of how the taxation system works. And from my time in Norway, I know something about that. There is a huge difference clearly between the amount of resourcing that's going into local municipalities to what, for instance, is going into the Highland Council, where I live here in Scotland. I'd be very interested to know if anybody knows what that difference is. The other thing I did want to point out is that in addition to multiple different kinds of taxes, which I've experienced municipalities can and often do charge, including dog taxes and all sorts of things, they also have been empowered to take the revenue from local natural resources. And actually in Norway, the main one for that is hydropower. And hydropower exists right throughout the country. Not every municipality has it, but those that do have it can derive huge amounts of money. So I do remember ages and ages ago for the Lagan dam and power station, a local person saying that, Dr. Richardson, that something like £5 million in revenue comes in from the Lagan power station every year, not a penny of which went to Lagan. It all went to a centralised company. If that had been Norway, all of that money could have gone into the local municipality, or they can have partnership agreements with the private sector, or they can tax the private sector. So it's a massive difference, and I've been to very, very isolated communities up in the mountains in Norway that are stinking rich, basically. They've got every facility you would ever want, Rolls Royce, and it's coming from hydropower money. And that's another thing that we don't do in this country.
Well, we do, to quite an extent. I live in Strathnairn, and we get quite a lot of money from renewable energy wind farms in the area. And that's democratically controlled, what happens to that benefit fund and so forth. And there's only 1,300 people. Interesting, Le Havre, the local people were interested in a community right to buy over the hydroelectric scheme and so on, and they didn't want it because they didn't want to take the risk. And we were there on the day they made that decision. So again, there's often a lot of studies and nuances around what pictures are like. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors as well in Scotland.
I think there's a very big difference in scale there, though, Mike. The kind of money we get as a sort of off the table from energy companies is tiny compared to...
Not in the case of Le Havre.
Or maybe not, I don't know. But generally speaking, it's peanuts compared to what they would get. But anyway, it's just a point that the municipalities have the power to totally control the income from power stations if they want to.
Because they own the power station.
They might do.
Yeah, and that's the big difference. Where communities are owning wind farms, so on South US, Benbecula, Gia, and so on, then the money goes to them. And there is democratic control because it goes through the community or the development trust or whatever. So we do have models in Scotland, but they tend to be the exception rather than the norm.
Right. Now let's have just a little roundup here, because I'm still, of course, there's comments coming in here thick and fast. Dan, are you able to do a little summary of the comments that have come in that I have missed, which are many of them?
Thanks, Lesley. So we kind of have some broad themes. A lot of the comments and questions we've had have been around, taxation, funding, etc., finances. We've just touched on. I think a couple of comments have gone back to the issues around economies of scale, and there's one particular one that we've not really addressed. We talked a little bit about staffing in terms of part-time staff from the video, etc., for smaller municipalities, education directors, for example. But there's questions right at the start from Jason about is there competition for staff, because presumably there's a scant supply of qualified staff. So that's been an issue that's come up a little bit. There's been talk about, following on from the conversation just there, about equivalents, sort of models of local democracy. The Shetland Charitable Trust has been talked about. Dave mentioned that. There's some chat from Andy Whiteman about that, whether that's comparable or not. And also a question from Kevin about the Community Empowerment Act, whether that actually would allow for some of some sort of replication of these approaches within Scotland. Similar to that, Patricia asks, what can we do with existing powers? Andy Whiteman came back on Kevin's question about the Community Empowerment Act, saying no, actually undermines local democracy. But the question remains from Patricia: well, what can we do with the existing powers? Interesting question from Kenneth MacArthur. I thought, which Scottish local councils are the right size? And we had that discussion about Clackmannan earlier, tied into that as well. Most of the other comments, questions seem to be mainly around the taxation and financing issue that we've covered already. So I think we've covered everything fairly comprehensively, Lesley.
Okay, great. Well, actually, that was, now that I see it, that question from Jason at the beginning was a real good one. Jason, are you still with us? Jason McGill, and that's also a hell of a name, actually. Jason, are you still there? He might have.
He's still in. He's still in.
No? Okay.
I'm going to ask him to unmute.
Yep, unmute, Jason, and just talk about that, because this is a good question. I think people do worry, but it all sounds fine in theory. But there's this tremendous worry Scots have got about not being capable. I've got to say, it drives me bonkers. But I would love to hear how Dennis answers it. So, Jason, are you there? Right, you're being a wee shy lamb. So, Dennis, can you see that question? And it was just summarised there by Dan. How does each municipality develop or recruit staff with specialist knowledge or technical skills? Is there a risk of quality staff being poached by other councils?
I think first I will refer to what Joe was mentioning, because you mentioned that people were called Malvik to their last name and so on. And I dare argue that because of these local democracies that we have in the Faroes and also in Norway, people really get attached to their local community because they know they can make a difference. So what we see in the Faroes is that people are really, if they really have the opportunity to move back to the local place where they come from, they do that after they have been abroad or in Tórshavn and gotten higher education. And we see that more and more that the skilled people move back to, for example, the community of Waver, people move back to that. And I don't think we see communities poaching or stealing staff from each other. We don't see that so much, because it's also about local pride. If you move back to your local community, you move back to that community and not to work in a competing neighboring community.
This is what interests me, because the presumption behind the question is slightly that there are a few gifted people who are like gold dust. And you have to get them from somewhere else. They're not actually going to be in your midst. You're not living amongst skilled people who are capable of running their town. And this makes me weep, because it's such a deep-seated belief or presumption here that that's the case. And I mean, listening to you, I'm sure you're a very capable man, but you're easy with it. There's a sort of presumption that everybody will be able to run their own place. Why would Scotland be any different?
Yeah, another thing is that the general trend is that our younger generations, they're all getting education also in the Faroes. I'm sure you know that trend also, and have that trend in Scotland. And we see that people move back to also the small. We only have something like 1,400 people here, and if you look at the families that have moved back over the last 5-6 years, most of them are academics. Academics with the highest skilled academics, either getting jobs locally in the town, getting jobs on the island, or commuting to jobs in other places both in the world, but also in other places in the Faroes, commuting on a weekly basis, commuting on a monthly basis, with 1 month abroad and 1 month in the Faroes. So because people are choosing to live in a small place where they can make a difference. And I think that's really important, that this opportunity to make a difference on how your life can develop in a small place.
And just pursue that thought for a minute, because we didn't take all of your slides, but what it showed was that all the improvements you made, which were very much, many of them, about facilities, swimming, that brilliant swimming pool, that brilliant sports high school, other things. You had a football tournament, you had a handball tournament that doubled the population in Vagar for the 4 or 5 days it was held. All of those things would seem, they're ambitious, and they have actually resulted in your population beginning to rise again.
Yeah, today we had this one part of this football competition between schools, and we had something like 55% of all of the various pupils in the 6th grade coming here to this town. More than 400 pupils were here today, and it's all about when you have a local democracy and you have a local tax base and you have a local town council and people know that they can make a difference. We have really been focusing on that we want things to happen here so we can create good memories for our youngsters. And if you can be here in Waver, in a very small town, and have good experiences and have good stories during your youth time as a child and a youngster, then the probability of moving back is much higher. So we have really been investing in creating good memories from the place you're growing up. And this is a politic that we can see that many other municipalities in the Faroes, they are adopting, focusing on creating good memories in the place that you grew up.
And you're pretty confident that if, to go back to your island, which has the 7 councils on it, if you were one council, and you would still be the smallest council in Scotland by a mile, 4,000, would that not have happened? Would you not have been able to go ahead with their swimming pool project?
I don't think we would have been able to go ahead because, of course, this from Scotland also. It's a common thing all over the world, also all over the North Atlantic, that when you have towns and villages that are comparable size, that are neighboring towns and villages, they typically compete. And if we had one municipality on the island here with this 11 towns and villages that are here, then I think that for the first maybe decade or something like that, it would have been in the fight in the council, the island council, instead of allowing the towns that have a municipality today to focus on creating development for themselves. This town is the second largest town in Surrey. We have focused on the experience economy. The largest town, they have focused on fisheries. And another town is focused on creating best possible opportunities for families with children. And this is the dynamics of a small local community, that you can focus on creating or walking the path that you choose to walk with the local people.
So you're saying then that if you had been one big council, there would be stalemate, because everybody would want that school, everybody would want that one investment, and you would spend a lot of time. I mean, we know this happens, that there's huge arguments politically. In fact, that's what politics can often be about, simply who manages to get what for their ward.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so you think you're free to just use your energies where you are?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. If this island was one municipality, I'm sure that the swimming pool had not been built. I'm sure that the sports facility, sports hall, had not been built. The sports high school maybe could have been built. But we have a story here in this island where we have the national politics interfering with the what we wanted to do on the island, and we have actually built upper secondary school on the island. But instead of building it either in this town, the second largest town, or in further the largest town, it's built in between the towns. So everybody that wants to go to upper secondary school on Surrey, they have to drive to this upper secondary school because it's in the midst of nowhere. And that's the really stupid thing about large politics. When you come into large politics, that you get these infights of where should you put a school, a hospital, or on a home for the elderly, and so on. And typically people want to fight for it, to have it placed in their town or their municipality. But if you have a local town council, you can focus on what you want in your local town.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, we normally run for 1.5 hours, and we're there. We're just over that. This is so fascinating that I think people are still with us. That question that's still sitting there: what is the ideal size? Well, just to say that the average size across the EU and across the Nordics, I think in Norway, is 10,000. That's the average size. So that's taking in big cities like Glasgow, Edinburgh, and creating an average of 10,000. That's true across the whole of Europe. And we have an average of 175,000. So, it's an interesting one to ask how we can change this in Scotland, how we can begin to get a discussion going about this. But to my mind, the appetite and belief that people have a place that they believe in, that they have got roots in, that's it all. It seems to me there's a very strong connection with this question of land ownership, because we haven't had that over centuries to the same degree as other normal countries. But we have to start now because we are wasting the energy of people. And I personally have been involved in community buyouts. Certainly they work. They're the exception. We need defaults, normals, normal ways of behaving that just pours the energy of local people into the very place they're in. And I was thinking of one community discussion I was involved in Ardnamurchan, where the people of Strontian actually ended up building a school. And I asked them if they would be happier if they'd had a small council, an Ardnamurchan council, that would have matched it, because their discussions were being held with a very remote Highland Regional Council, 2 days away, or a long drive away. And actually, they said they wouldn't even have got involved with an Ardnamurchan council. That was too big. That what they were interested in was literally their school, nothing bigger than that. And in a way, at the time, I thought, gosh, right. But, listening tonight to our Norwegian colleague who's absent and to Dennis who's present, the reason is that is the right size. The size that you're talking about on your island is the school. That's the main thing as parents. That's the main thing that people get connected with. And that keeps reinforcing an awful lot of their energies. So, maybe we need some very major rethinking here. But anyway, Dennis, thank you very much. I hope one day, I would love to come and visit you in the Faroes, but I think we would love to have you come here again, sometime, and try and kick off some greater interest in all of this. I think there's been lots of questions here from people tonight, so thank you very much for that. I should thank everybody behind the scenes who's made this possible, to Mike Danson and Dan Wynn, who's part of the Nordic Horizons team. Now, we're going to finish just with a couple of polls, if you could just bear with us. Let's do that one again, the one that we started with. Who thinks Scotland's local councils are truly local? Can we have that poll again, Dan? Okay, so everybody, hopefully will come off the fence this time. And vote now or lose your vote.
So we have votes still coming in. We have 32 people voted, 33. Slowly trickling in. I think I'm going to do a countdown if that's all right, folks. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to end the poll now and share the results.
Right. Well, it started off with, was it 84%? We're now at 92. I mean, this is so delightfully statistically invalid. But still, for those of you who've stayed in it, you've become a bit more convinced about the size issue as we've gone along. We've just got one other question to ask you. Here we are, because we're trying to, we actually produce a podcast, which is the kind of edited highlights of this debate. And it's on the website on Monday after we've had each of these events. So it's really quite a compact, listenable thing. Were you aware that we do these podcasts? It would be good to know that. And then after it, now that you do know that we do these podcasts, would you share the links to the podcast to somebody else who you think might be interested? Right. So a 2-part vote for those of us who were around in 1997. You'll know how to do that.
So
or was it 99?
34 people voted so far. That's 80% nearly. Oh, it's creeping up just a little bit. I'm going to do another countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And here are the results.
Okay, so I did think this, that people didn't know that there was a podcast. Look at your wee lambs. Will you share it? Of course you will. What lovely people you are. It would be great if you did do that. As you know, we get no government support or money. We are very delighted that we got some crowdfunding to be able to put these events on. So there ain't no big publicity machine sitting anywhere. There's me. There's Mike doing our Nordic Horizons. So if you can manage to push this out, just think if there's anybody that this would be relevant for, particularly people who live in rural and remote areas. Because I think the thing Dennis really wanted to say, perhaps we should just let you say this to finish, is that remote areas are going to be the worst affected as the traditional industries begin to disappear if they don't have the power right in their hands in small communities as time goes on.
Yeah, I don't know if I can make this short. I'll try to make this short. But what we see happening is that we get, for example, in the Faroes and also around the North Atlantic, we see larger and larger companies emerging and people just thinking about new trends of their lives. I mentioned it earlier. I think taking control of your life, taking control of your time, focusing on nature, environment, and so on. And we see that people are moving back to rural areas. Actually, Oslo is for the first time, maybe in 100 years or something like that, have a stagnation in population because people are moving out of Oslo. And if you're moving out to a rural place or a remote place or a small place, you really want to have an influence. So the importance of a local democracy, a local council, and a local tax base cannot be underestimated, I think. I think that's a really important part of creating the good life for people.
Yep. Okay. Well, look, amen to that. Thank you very much for your time tonight, Dennis. I really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody who's joined us. And please remember, I'm going to put those podcast links on social media, and it's also there on the website, nordichorizons.org, on Monday. So thank you very much, everybody. And we'll be back in another couple of months with another event. So good night, all. And I was going to say safe home, but you are home. So I'll see you again.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.